Sanaa, the 22nd of May, 2007. On the great parade ground of al-Sabeen Square, 100,000 people stood shoulder to shoulder for the anniversary of Yemeni unity. Somewhere inside that mass was a man who had not walked an open street in 11 years. His name was Muin al-Haffar, and he had built his life around a single rule that had kept him breathing: never appear anywhere a crowd could not be. He believed that no service on earth would strike where 100 strangers would die beside him. He was almost right. 12 people had entered the square that morning as strangers to one another, and not one of them believed the crowd was a danger. It was the weapon. This was Operation Palisade. Welcome to Mission Breakdowns, where we take apart the operations that were never meant to be understood. Subscribe and stay in the room with us. Begin with the rule, because the rule is the whole story. For the last 11 years of his life, Muin al-Haffar did not stand anywhere that a crowd could not stand with him. He did not take coffee at a pavement table. He did not pray in a small mosque with a handful of the faithful. He did not attend a wedding of 40 guests or a funeral of 60. When he moved surrounded, and when he stopped inside a press of bodies so thick that no stranger could reach him without climbing over the shoulders of the men in between. This was not fear. Fear is clumsy, and al-Hafar was not clumsy. It was a calculation, and by the standards of the trade, it was a good one. He had reasoned his way to it, the way an engineer reasons his way to a load-bearing wall. He had decided that the men who wanted him dead were professionals, and that professionals do not act where the arithmetic turns against them. A shot fired into a crowd kills the wrong people. A device planted in a crowd kills by the dozen. A blade drawn in a crowd is seen by 100 witnesses before it is clean. Every method his hunters owned depended on catching him alone, and so he had removed being alone from his life entirely. He had paid for it, and he knew the price. A man who is never alone is never private. He could not take a quiet walk. He could not sit unwatched with his own thoughts. He had traded the whole texture of an ordinary life for the one thing that kept him alive, and he had made the trade with his eyes open because he understood exactly who was looking for him. What he had authorized in the name of the reprisal command had earned that attention. The faction sat at the rejectionist end of the era's militant landscape, and al-Hafar ran its operations abroad. The planning, the money, the men sent out to do harm in other countries and slip home again. He had spent years as a signature at the bottom of orders, a voice on a telephone line, a name that surfaced in the wreckage of things and then went quiet. Services do not forget a man like that. They keep his file open across changes of government and changes of staff, handing it down from one officer to the next like an unpaid debt. By the spring of 2007, his file had been open a very long time, and the people who held it had grown tired of writing the same line at the bottom of every entry: located, watched, unreachable. He was, in the language of the faction he served, the external operations chief of the reprisal command. Inside it, he was known by another name, Abu Adham, and by that name he had signed off on operations that had put him near the top of more than one service's list. He was early into his 50s in the spring of 2007, a heavy, unhurried man who had learned patience the way exiles learn it, by having nothing else. He had been in Sanaa since the middle of the 1990s, more than a decade, and in all that time the men watching him had never once had him in the open by himself. They had photographs of him, most of them years old. They had his voice on intercepts, and a thick file of his movements, and a rough sense of his days. What they did not have was a single moment when reaching him would not also mean killing the innocent. And that missing moment was the only reason he was still breathing. A later assessment set it down in one flat line. The problem had never been finding al-Hafar. The problem was that he had turned the crowd into armor, and armor is not beaten by wanting it beaten. It is beaten only by understanding, better than the man wearing it, exactly how it is made. Sanaa in 2007 was a good place to be a hunted man. The city sits high, higher than almost any capital on earth, 2,286 meters above the sea, 7,500 feet, on a plateau caught between two mountains, Jabal Nukum to the east and Jabal Iban to the west. The air is thin, the light is hard and bright, and strangers arrive short of breath and stay conspicuous. A foreign face does not dissolve into Sanaa the way it dissolves into a European capital. It is noticed, it is remembered, it is sometimes asked its business. The old heart of the city made the point in stone. Sanaa's walled quarter holds thousands of tower houses, some 14,000 of them, built up in dark basalt and limestone at the base and fired brick above, their upper rooms lit through camarilla. Fanlight windows of colored glass set in white gypsum, so that at night the houses glow from within. Strangers came to see the Great Gate, Bab al-Yemen, and the covered markets behind it, and the great mosque that is among the oldest in the world. A man could vanish into those alleys for an hour. He could not live there unseen. The country around Al-Hafar was a country at low, grinding war with itself. President Ali Abdullah Saleh had ruled the north since the late 1970s and the Unified Republic since its birth on the 22nd of May, 1990. 4 years after that unification, the South had tried to break away, and in the summer of 1994, Saleh's forces had ended the attempt in 70 days of fighting that killed roughly 1,500 people and left several thousand more wounded. The victory of unity was the thing the state paraded every May, and it paraded it with everything it had. By the middle of the decade, a newer war had opened in the far north, in Sayada, where fighting had begun in June of 2004 and had already run through several bloody rounds. The movement's founder had been killed by government troops that same September, and his people had fought on. Down on the coast, the memory of the warship bombed in Aden Harbor in the autumn of 2000 still sat in every foreign threat assessment. In April of 2005, one Western government told its citizens plainly that the danger across Yemen remained high because of terrorist activity. This was a country where a man like al-Haffar could find patrons, protection, and a crowd to stand inside, and where the men hunting him could not simply hire a car and follow him down a street. Daily life ran to its own clock, and the clock would matter. Sanaa worked in the morning and chewed in the afternoon. By 2 o'clock, most offices had emptied, the men of the city gone indoors to sit for hours over the mild green leaf they called cat, a habit so nearly universal that half the country was somewhere inside its haze on any given day. Money moved in small notes of Yemeni real. The traffic was Toyota Land Cruisers and older Peugeot taxis. A mobile telephone could carry a call or a short written message and nothing more. A rally that ran past the early afternoon would be a rally the city itself wanted finished, its people already drifting toward the leaf and the long shaded rooms. That habit, so ordinary that no one gave it a thought, would end up woven into the timing of a killing. The reprisal command kept al-Hafar comfortable and kept him surrounded. His close protection was run by a hard, careful man named Ghazi Miqdad, who had spent his life around principles and believed correctly that most attacks come in the thin moments, the car door, the empty stair, the quiet street after dark. Miqdad had built his whole doctrine around denying those moments. What he had never planned for was the reverse of a thin moment. He had never once planned for too many people. The break, when it finally came, did not come from a spy. It came from a page of physics. For years, the file on al-Hafar had been a file about access, and access was the exact thing he had made impossible. Then a Tel Aviv desk analyst named Ella Frisch, working under the codename Kingbird, stopped asking how to pull a man out of a crowd and started asking a stranger question. What, precisely, is a crowd? She went to the open scientific literature, the published study of how human beings behave when they are packed tightly together, and she found a body of work that read, to her trained eye, like the specification of a weapon. The science was not secret. It had been built over decades by Western engineers and physicists. John Fruin, whose levels of service had first set down how dense a crowd can grow before it turns lethal, and later the crowd scientist Keith Still and the physicist Dirk Helbing, who had described what happens out at the far, dangerous end of that scale. The numbers were exact, and Frisch laid them out the way an artillery officer lays out a firing table. At 1 or 2 people to the square meter, a person moves freely, turns, walks where he likes. At 3 or 4, movement is still easy and the wrist stays low. At 5, moving becomes hard, and a man must wait for gaps. At 6 or 7 people to the square meter, a human being is pressed on every side and can no longer move at will. The crowd simply holds him where he stands, like a hand closed around him. At 8 to 10, he is carried along, whether he wants to be or not, his feet barely his own. And at around 10 to the square meter, people begin to die, not by being trampled underfoot, as the myth has it, but by the slow crushing of the ribcage that the science calls compressive asphyxia. A crowd at that density kills its own from the inside, standing up. None of this was theory dressed up as fact. It was the grim arithmetic behind real disasters, the crushes at stadiums and shrines and festivals where scores of people had died standing upright, wedged so tightly that their lungs could not fill, long after the panic that started it had burned itself out. Investigators who reconstructed those tragedies found the same signature every time, not the wild stampede of the imagination, but a slow, silent compression and a single fall that pulled a dozen more down into the space it opened. Frisch read those reports the way a weapons analyst reads results from a test range. The danger was documented, repeatable, and exact. There was one further line, and it was the line that turned the whole file over. Above 6 or 7 to the square meter, a crowd stops behaving like a gathering of separate people and begins to behave like a fluid. Push it at one edge, and the push does not stay at the edge. It travels through the whole mass as a wave of pressure that Helbing's work named crowd turbulence, running through the packed bodies the way a swell runs through water. The people caught in it do not choose to move. The physics moves them. And when one of them falls, the space he leaves becomes a void that the pressure around it collapses into, one body pulling the next down after it. Frisch's conclusion sat at the bottom of the page in a single sentence, and it inverted everything the file had assumed for a decade. Al-Hafar had chosen the crowd because inside it no one could reach him. But a crowd dense enough to be armor was, by the published numbers, no longer a crowd of separate people at all. It was a body of water, and a body of water can be read and timed and steered. The recommendation went up the chain. The authorization to try came back down under a code name that described exactly what they intended to build inside the mass: a fence, an unseen wall of bodies. They called it Palisade. The plan that formed around Frisch's page rested on a hard, proven shape, and the shape was not weapons. It was people. A generation of operations had taught one lesson about acting against a well-guarded man in a public place. You flood that place with officers who never appear to be together, each carrying a single small piece of the task, none of them holding enough to give away the whole. The template was documented in the trade, and it was almost boringly reliable. In one later operation, inside a Gulf hotel, a service would put more than 24 officers into a single building, arriving in waves from different European cities, split into separate teams that never mixed. Watchers here, logistics there, a small element that did the actual work, all of them moving under foreign passports, routing their few messages through a third country, and leaving the country inside a single day. Most were gone within hours. All were clear before the body was found. Speed of exit was the entire defense, and the principle beneath it was simpler still. A large operation does not have to look large. It only has to look like ordinary life. For Palisade, the planners took that shape and bent it to a far harder setting than a hotel. 12 officers. Not one of them would know more than a fraction of the others. The mission commander, a case officer named Erez Salomon, working under the codename Gargani, would run the operation from a forward post outside the square, holding the only complete picture that existed anywhere. Inside the crowd, the man who would physically assemble the 12 was a field commander named Guy Carrett, codenamed Shoveler, moving under the legend of a Gulf-era businessman, with an ordinary reason to be in Sanaa for the anniversary. The 12 were divided by what they did and never by who they knew. Some were perimeter, the human bodies that would become the load-bearing points of the wall. The 2 who would take the positions nearest the target were officers named Omer Talmy and Dana Kaplan, under the code names Smew and Eider. One officer, a woman named Adi Sharet under the codename Jacana, carried a task that belonged to no one else in the operation. She would stand inside the crowd and read it, feel the density change against her own ribs, judge the exact instant the mass crossed from people into fluid, and call the surge. And one, an exfiltration coordinator named Tal Avidan under the codename Stint, held the map of the only way any of them would get out. They trained apart. They were briefed in pieces, each officer told what his own part required and almost nothing else. A debrief taken afterward recorded that several of the 12 never learned the names of the others they had stood beside, and that 2 of them believed, right up until it was over, that the operation numbered 8 people, not 12. That was not carelessness. That was the design. 12 strangers, one morning, and no single thread that one arrest or one loose word could ever pull loose. The compartmentalization was not only a guard against capture, it was a guard against the crowd itself. If any one of the 12 was recognized, questioned, or simply swept out of position by the press of bodies, no other officer's part depended on knowing why. The wall could lose a brick and still stand, because no brick carried the blueprint. Salomon, at his forward post, held the blueprint alone, and he held it on paper and in his own head, not on any wire that a sweep could catch. The few signals that would pass on the day were pre-agreed and ran one way only. A thing seen, never a conversation had. It made the operation slow, rigid, and unforgiving of the smallest error. It also made it very nearly impossible to unravel from the inside, because there was no inside for an interrogator to reach. Before a single officer boarded a flight, the operation had already decided where al-Haffar would die, and it had decided it by studying a fence. Al-Sabeen Square is not a square in the ornamental sense. It is a broad ceremonial ground in the south of Sanaa, a sweep of open lanes wide enough to march an army down, standing near the presidential palace. On its southern edge, in the spring of 2007, a great mosque was rising in scaffolding, the building that would open the following year, in 2008, but which for now was only girders and dust and cranes, no landmark yet, just noise and hoarding at the corner of the ground. This was where the state held its parades. This was where it would hold the anniversary of unity. Every year, the same kind of hands laid that ground out. The crushed barriers, the standing pens, the raised reviewing stand for the officials and the honored guests. All of it was built to a plan, and the plan was drawn weeks in advance by an event services subcontractor named Hamoud al-Sharabi. Al-Sharabi was a working man with a contract from the celebrations committee, nothing more. He never knew a foreign service existed. He was never approached, never used in any knowing way, and never harmed. He simply did his job in the open, where anyone with eyes could watch him do it, and his job settled the single question Palisade needed answered above all others: exactly where the crowd would pack tightest. Because a crowd does not fill a space evenly. It pools, it jams against barriers, and it thins in the open lanes, the way water finds its levels. Frisch and her people took al-Sharabi's barrier layout and ran the numbers across it, marking the ground the way a surveyor marks a floodplain. Here, in the open lanes, the density would sit at 3 or 4 to the square meter, and a man could still turn and move. Here, in the honored pen against the barrier line before the reviewing stand, it would climb past 6, past 7, into the range where nobody moves at all. They knew the position of the wall before a single soul had arrived to build it. Getting to that certainty had taken weeks of patient, unglamorous work. Al-Sharabi's barriers went up in stages, and each stage was photographed and measured from the ordinary vantage points any onlooker might use: a nearby roof, a passing car, the windows of buildings that overlooked the ground. Frisch's people fed the measurements into their model and watched the dangerous zones settle onto the plan like sediment. They cross-checked the layout against the parades of earlier years, because the state was a creature of habit and built its ground the same way each May. They knew where the honored pen would sit, where its barriers would funnel the honored guests, and how the crowd behind them would jam against those barriers as the ground filled. By the time the operation flew, the plan in Tel Aviv showed the killing ground in more detail than most of the men who would stand on it had ever bothered to notice. And they knew where al-Hafar would stand, because his own standing decided it for them. A man of his rank did not take a place in the thin lanes with the ordinary crowd. He stood where the honored guests stood, in the dense pen before the reviewing stand. In the exact patch of ground the numbers had already painted red. His shield had a flaw, and his own logic had built it. The tighter the crowd he chose for safety, the more completely the physics could be turned against him. By the time the operation flew, the killing ground had been chosen, mapped, and marked on a plan in Tel Aviv, a rectangle of bare dust in Sanaa that did not yet hold a single living person. Getting 12 officers into Sanaa was harder than getting them into almost any city in the operation's history, and every planner knew it. This was not a European capital where a foreign face passes unread in a stationed crowd. Here, a stranger was seen, remembered, and now and then questioned. The cover could not merely look right, it had to belong to the place. So the 12 came through 12 different doors, and each door had its own honest reason. Some arrived under Gulf Arab legends, traders and businessmen from the peninsula, faces and papers that belonged at a national celebration and drew no second look. Some came credentialed as the kind of foreign observers and press a state actually wants at its own anniversary, there to photograph the parade the government was proud of. They flew in across a span of days from scattered cities, no two of them together, exactly as the proven shape demanded. A man who arrives alone, for a stated reason, on an ordinary flight, is not a team. He is a traveler. 12 travelers are not an operation. They are a coincidence. They carried almost nothing that could betray them. In 2007, a mobile telephone in Sanaa could carry a spoken call or a short written message and no more. There was no map in a man's pocket, no silent stream of data marking where he had been. None of the electronic trail a later decade would scatter behind every step. That absence was an advantage. It meant Palisade ran on the oldest tradecraft there is. Prearranged signals, fixed times, agreed places, and human memory. A newspaper folded a particular way. A bag shifted from one shoulder to the other. A hat taken off and held for account. 12 people who never once spoke to each other could still act as a single body, because everything they would need to say had already been said, in a briefing room, before any of them ever landed. Underneath all of it ran a warning, and the warning came from an old and famous failure. Years before, in a small Norwegian town, another team had run an operation in a public place and got it catastrophically wrong. The wrong man killed in front of witnesses, officers arrested, a whole service humiliated in the world's newspapers. The men who studied that disaster drew one iron rule from it, and Palisade was built around that rule from the first day. A cover is not a costume. It is a behavior. An officer who looks like a businessman but stands too long, watches too hard, or drifts against the current of a crowd is more exposed than a man in no disguise at all. Every one of the 12 had been drilled not simply to look ordinary, but to be ordinary, to buy the bottle of water, to grumble about the heat, to be carried through the day by the same tide of small, ordinary wants as everyone around them. By the third week of May, all 12 were inside the city, unremarkable, unconnected, and waiting on a single morning. The days before the parade were their own quiet test. Sanaa''s thin air punishes the newly arrived, and an officer gasping on a short flight of stairs draws exactly the kind of notice the operation could not afford. So the 12 had come early enough to let their bodies settle to the altitude. They kept ordinary hours. They shopped in the markets behind Bab al-Yemen, drank tea in the shade, complained about the heat and the climb of the streets, and let themselves be seen doing nothing of any interest. An officer who hides in his room is a puzzle a hotel remembers. An officer who is bored and sweaty, and visibly a trader or a tourist with time to kill, is a man no one thinks about twice. By the morning of the parade, each of them had spent days becoming precisely that. And precisely that was the deepest cover any of them wore. The morning of the 22nd of May began in darkness and in cold. Sanaa sits high enough that even in late May the hours before dawn are sharp, and the first of the crowd came to al-Sabeen in the dark with their arms wrapped and their heads covered against the chill of the mountain air. The parade would not reach its height for hours yet. The state wanted its crowd in place early, and the crowd came early, streaming toward the ground while the sky was still black over Jabal Nukum. The city had been shut for it. In the pattern the government used every year, the Republican Guard had closed the approach roads to al-Sabeen a full day before, a complete turn of the clock ahead of the parade, and had ringed the entrances to the city with checkpoints. The soldiers who would march had been searched at their own barracks before they were ever trucked in. Nothing reached that ground unwatched. From the outside, the security looked total, and to a man like al-Hafar, it read as a wall the state had built for his personal benefit. A locked city, a guarded square, 100,000 witnesses, everything his whole doctrine asked for, all of it provided free by the government he sheltered under. The 12 arrived as the crowd arrived, folded into it, each drifting onto the ground alone. At 0540 hours, in the gray just before sunrise, the first of the perimeter officers reached the pens before the reviewing stand and simply stopped, becoming one more citizen who had come early to hold a good place. Over the next 2 hours, the others came, one at a time, each taking up a position that meant nothing whatever on its own. a man here, a woman there, a figure resting against a barrier, spread across the dense ground in a pattern that made sense only when seen from above. And no one was seeing it from above. Salomon watched what he could from his forward post, but even he could not see the shape whole. The crowd swallowed detail from the outside as surely as it did from within. He was running the operation half-blind, on trust and on the clock, waiting for the density itself to lock his scattered people into the wall the model had promised. There was nothing to do now but let the square fill. Inside the crowd, Addie Sherritt began to work the one instrument the operation owned that no camera and no model could replace. She read the density with her own body. Early, in the cold, the ground was loose, 3 to the square meter, perhaps less. Room to turn, room to breathe, room to lift a hand to her face. She marked it the way a sailor marks a slack tide, a thing that would not stay slack for long. As the sun came up and the ground filled, the numbers would climb, and somewhere in that climb, they would cross the line Frisch had drawn on her page, the line past which the 100,000 would stop being people and become water. Sherritt's task was to feel that crossing arrive before any instrument could show it, and to keep her nerve while the very crowd she stood inside thickened into the thing that would kill a man a few meters away. By 0800 hours, the ground was 2/3 full and still thickening by the minute. The clock had started, and it was not the operations clock. It belonged to the crowd, and to the city, and to the quart that would pull Sanaa indoors by the early afternoon. Whatever Palisade meant to do, it had to be done while the square was at its very fullest, in the few hours before the anniversary spent itself, and the people began to drift home to the shaded rooms and the green leaf. Somewhere out beyond the barriers, in a slow-moving knot of hard men, Muin al-Haffar had still not arrived. The perimeter did not look like anything at all. That was the whole point of it. If a watcher on the reviewing stand had scanned the pens in front of him at 0900 hours, he would have seen 100,000 indistinguishable people waiting for a parade. He would not have seen that 11 of them, scattered through the mass in a rough ring, were standing with intent, holding positions that boxed a patch of ground about the size of a small room. There were no radios chattering, no wires at anyone's collar, no cluster of watchful men giving the game away. There was a woman easing a bag on her shoulder. There was a trader mopping the back of his neck in the climbing heat. There was a man near a barrier who seemed to be doing nothing but waiting, like every soul around him, for the marching to begin. Guy Carrot moved through it slowly, the single figure who could see the whole shape and adjust it, correcting the ring by inches without appearing to correct anything. A word to no one. A signal passed by the tilt of a folded newspaper. An officer drifting a few feet to close a space that only Carrot knew was a space at all. He was assembling a wall out of human beings who were already standing there, and the mortar holding it together was the crowd itself, packing tighter around each of his people minute by minute as the ground filled toward its limit. He had done smaller versions of this before, in other cities and thinner crowds, but never on this scale, and never with the crowd itself as the structure. The ordinary tools of his trade were useless here. He could not cluster his people, could not brief them with a glance, could not pull a man off a bad position without the whole square watching one figure fight the tide. He could only place and wait and trust the numbers to do what the briefing room had sworn they would. The density was doing the real work now, exactly as Frisch had promised it would. At 3 to the square meter, a ring of 11 people is nothing. Anyone can slip between them. At 5, it is a mild nuisance, a thing you push past with a muttered apology. But as the ground climbed past 6, the spaces between Carrot's officers stopped being spaces a person could pass through. The crowd pressed into every gap until the gap itself went solid, and the 11 ceased to be a scattered ring of separate individuals. They became the fixed points of a wall that 100,000 strangers had built without the faintest idea they were building it. A wall no guard could force, because at that density, no human being on Earth can force his way through anything. Sherritt felt the ground cross the line a little after 0930 hours. She was pinned now, held upright and unable to turn, gripped by the bodies on every side, 6 to the square meter, then closer to 7. The crowd gone from a gathering into a single pressing mass with one will and no will at all. In her own account afterward, she described the moment with a strange, flat precision, because the training held even as the human part of her understood exactly what she was standing inside. She had modeled this on paper 100 times in a quiet room in Tel Aviv. Standing in it was another thing entirely. She could not raise her arms. She could feel her own heartbeat answered in the press of the strangers crushed against her. And she understood, with the cold part of her mind that never stopped counting, that if the wave came wrong, too hard, or in the wrong line, the people pinning her were the very people she would fail to save. Then the calculation reached its end, and she put the fear down where it could not reach her hands and went back to reading the tide. The mission continued. At 0950 hours, the operation nearly died, and it nearly died because of the one factor no plan can command. The target moved. Al-Hafar had come onto the ground late, the way men of his standing always do, folded into a knot of Ghazi Miqdad's men, and steered toward the honored pen before the reviewing stand. Toward the exact patch of dense ground the numbers had painted red weeks earlier in another country on a plan he would never see. For a quarter of an hour everything held. He stood where the operation needed him to stand, inside the killing rectangle, hemmed on every side by a crowd that had become his executioner and had no idea it had. Then something shifted along the reviewing stand. A protocol officer, fussing over the arrangement of guests, began to move the honored party a few meters along the barrier to open a clean sightline for one of the state cameras. Miqdad, who trusted nothing and no one, went with it, and Al-Hafar went with Miqdad, drifting sideways out of the mapped rectangle toward a stretch of barrier where the density fell away and the pen opened into a thinner lane. In the space of a minute, the target was walking himself out of the trap without knowing a trap existed. From his forward post outside the square, Salomon could not touch it. He had no man who could give an instruction to a protocol officer, no way to reach across the sealed ground, nothing but the picture in front of him, and 11 people already locked into a crowd they could no longer move through at will. This was the buried flaw in a wall built out of a crowd. A wall of bodies is enormously strong, but it is desperately slow to rebuild, because the same density that makes it strong makes each of its own bricks unable to walk. For those few minutes, the operation hung on a thing no one had rehearsed, because no rehearsal could reproduce it. Salomon's instinct was to hold, to let the target drift, break off, and wait for another day, another crowd, another anniversary. But there might not be another. Al-Hafar surfaced in public only a handful of times a year, always behind 100,000 people, and the intelligence that had placed him at this rally might never place him so exactly again. To abandon the morning was to hand back 11 years of patience and begin again from nothing. Salomon let it run and trusted Carrot and the 2 nearest officers to do the one thing the crowd still permitted, move slowly and only with the tide. It fell to Carrot and to the 2 nearest officers, Talmi and Kaplan. They could not run, nobody in that press could run. But a crowd at 7 to the square meter still has a current, small shifts and slacks of pressure that a trained body can feel and lean into and ride. Over the next 4 minutes, without one sudden movement between them, the 2 perimeter officers let the crowd's own microcurrents carry them along the barrier, staying level with the target, reforming the box around his new position a few inches at a time, the way a slick of oil reshapes itself across moving water. Charette, pinned some 20 feet off, read the changed geometry and passed the correction to Carrot with nothing more than the turn of her head and the angle of her eyes. By 0958 hours, the honored party had halted again, the camera satisfied, Al-Hafar settled into his new place, and the unseen wall had quietly closed around him there, in ground that had itself thickened past 6 to the square meter in the very minutes it took him to arrive. The trap had followed the man. He had walked from one dense patch of crowd to another, and both times he had believed that he was choosing his own ground. Everything now waited on a single question, and it was the one question the operation flatly refused to hurry. Was the man in the pen actually Muin al-Haffar? The old Norwegian disaster hung over this moment more heavily than over any other. A service that acts on a glimpse kills the wrong man, and a service that kills the wrong man in front of 100,000 witnesses does not get to try again. Salomon's rule, written down before anyone flew, was absolute and unnegotiable. No one moved until the identification was certain. Not likely, not probable, certain past argument. the certainty was hard-won because al-Haffar had spent 11 years being difficult to see. In the cold of the early morning, he had come wrapped like everyone else on the ground, his head covered, the lower half of his face lost in folds of cloth. The photographs the operation held were years old and taken at a distance. A voice on an intercept was worth nothing in a square holding 100,000 voices. So the confirmation had to be built by eye, in daylight, from a few feet away, and it had to survive the standard every service applies after a disaster. Would this identification still hold if it turned out to be wrong? The two officers worked it like a checklist no one had written down. They matched what they could see against what the file had taught them to expect. And they discarded anything ambiguous rather than let a wish harden into a fact. A wrapped face is a hard problem, but a man betrays himself in 100 small, unconscious ways. How he carries his weight, what he does with his hands when he is bored, the tilt of the head toward a sudden sound. Each of those, checked and checked again, was a line and a proof, and the proof was not allowed to close until every line had been drawn. What the operation did have was proximity. Two officers, Talmi and Kaplan, now standing within a few feet of the man, closer to Muin al-Haffar than his own guards had ever imagined a stranger could get. They took their time, and the day gave them the tool they needed. As the sun climbed and the ground warmed toward mid-morning, the wraps came looser, the way they always do once the cold has burned off a crowd. Over perhaps 20 minutes, the two officers built the identification the way any careful thing is built. One confirmed detail laid on the last. The particular set of the heavy shoulders, a habit of the hands the file had recorded, an old mark on the skin that the file had also recorded, the exact way the man tilted his head when the massed band struck up and the parade began, at last, to roll down the ceremonial lanes. No single detail was proof on its own. Laid together, one by one, they closed the question past any doubt. There was a moment inside that identification that the debrief recorded and that stayed with the officers long afterward because it made the man human at the very worst possible time. Watching him from 3 feet away, one of the officers saw al-Haffar reach into a pocket and, without even looking down, pass a wrapped sweet, a small piece of barley sugar, to a little boy pressed against his leg in the crush, a child who belonged to some family beside him and whom he had plainly never met before that morning. The file carried a note about that very habit. Surveillance had recorded, years earlier, that the man always carried sweets in his pocket, though no watcher had ever worked out for whom. Now they knew. He was standing inside his armor of strangers, handing candy to another man's son in the last hour of his life, and he did not know he had an hour left. The identification was complete. Salomon gave the word to make ready. The only thing left to wait for now was the wave. The parade built toward its climax the way every such parade does, and the operation had chosen that climax as its single instant. At the height of the anniversary came the mass salute, the crash of ceremonial fire, the roar of aircraft passing low over al-Sabeen, the moment when 100,000 faces turn upward together to follow the sky. It is the loudest, most distracted second of the entire day. Every eye goes up. Every guard's eye goes up with it. For one held breath, no one in the square is looking at the man standing beside him. That was the second Ori Charette had been placed to find. Pinned in the press a few feet from the target, she had spent the whole morning reading the crowd toward exactly this pitch. And as the salute broke overhead and the mass surged instinctively upward and forward toward the noise and the sky, she felt the tide reach the level the numbers had promised her back in Tel Aviv. Past 7 to the square meter now, the 100,000 had become one body, a single mass that leaned and moved as one, and a push at its edge would run through the whole of it as a wave. She gave the signal to Carrot. Carrot passed it onward. At the far edge of the mapped ground, timed against the surge the salute had already set in motion, the operation added its own small pressure to the crowds, and the wave rolled inward through the packed bodies toward the honored pen. What happened at the center of that wave took seconds, and it was, by every account, almost without drama, because the flatness was the design. In the crush at the very height of the surge, with al-Haffar held motionless by the same density he had trusted to keep him safe, unable to turn, unable to lift an arm, unable to make even the smallest movement to defend himself, the two officers beside him did the thing they had come across the world to do. It was close and silent and over inside the space of a single upward glance, masked by the salute fire and the aircraft overhead, and the pressure of 10,000 bodies all leaning toward the sky. No shot was heard, because there was nothing to hear above the guns of the salute. No struggle was seen, because in a crowd at that density, there is no room in which to struggle. A man held so tightly that he cannot move, cannot fall, and cannot fight, and cannot cry out and be heard by anyone. Every assumption al-Hafar had built his life upon was, in that instant, working against him. He had trusted the crowd to keep a killer at arm's length, and the crowd had pinned his own arms to his sides. He had trusted the noise of a state occasion to smother any threat, and the noise had smothered the only warning he might have raised. He had trusted the sheer number of witnesses to make any act unthinkable, and the number of witnesses had become the very thing that hid the act completely. There is a cold symmetry to it that the operations planners had seen from the first day. The man had been undone by the very defenses he had spent 11 years building, turned inside out on the ground he had chosen because it felt the safest. Ghazi Miqdad, 3 feet away and pinned exactly as his principal was pinned, saw nothing, because there was nothing to see that looked like anything other than 100,000 people watching a fly past. For a moment longer, Muin al-Haffar stood upright among them, held on his feet by the very crowd that had just killed him, indistinguishable from every living soul packed around him. His shield had done the one thing a shield is never meant to do. It had held the man who wore it perfectly still, and it had held him still for the blade. Now came the half of the operation that had always been the hard half, not the act, but the leaving. 12 officers were standing inside a sealed city ringed with checkpoints, its every road closed by the Republican Guard, in a square where a wanted man had just died among his own guards. There was exactly one way out of that box, and it was the same force that had done everything else that morning: the crowd. The surge did not simply stop when the salute ended. A crowd that has crested toward one edge falls back and spreads, and as the parade rolled past its height, the 100,000 began, all at once, to loosen and to move, the enormous involuntary drift of a mass that has held its ground for hours in the sun and is ready, all together, to go home. It was mid-morning, and the city's own clock was already tugging at them, the long habit of the afternoon, and the green leaf waiting in the cool shaded rooms across Sanaa. The square, which had spent the morning drawing tighter and tighter, began at last to breathe out. The 12 went out with that breath. This was Tal Avidan's part of it, the map of the way out, and it worked precisely because it asked nothing unusual of a single person. No officer broke for an exit. No one moved a step faster than the people around him. Each simply dissolved back into the flow he had ridden in on hours before, one indistinguishable body in a tide of 100,000 pouring down the great lanes of al-Sabeen toward the checkpoints. And the checkpoints, built and manned to search for dangerous men coming into the square, were useless against the sheer mass going out of it. You cannot search 100,000 people leaving at once. You can only stand aside and let the flood pass through, and the flood carried the 12 out through the ring of the sealed city, the way a river carries leaves past a man standing in the shallows. The elegance of it was that nothing about the exit looked like an exit. The dangerous moment in most operations is the run for the border, the sudden change of pace that a trained watcher is taught to catch. Here there was no change of pace, because the entire city was leaving at the same speed at the same time. An officer walking briskly toward a checkpoint would have been a flag. An officer shuffling homeward in a tired, sunburned, 100,000-strong tide was invisible, because he was doing exactly what everyone around him was doing, and wanting exactly what everyone around him wanted, which was shade and water, and the end of a long morning. The crowd had built the wall, held the target, and hidden the act. Now it carried its makers out through the door. They left the country the way the proven shape had always said to leave it, quickly, separately, on scattered ordinary flights. No two of them together, most of them clear of Yemen within hours, and the last of them gone well inside a single day. By the time anyone in Sanaa began to understand that something had happened in al-Sabeen Square, the wall of 12 had already come apart into 12 strangers again, each of them a lone traveler with a plain and stated reason for his journey, moving out through a dozen different doors in a dozen different directions. Behind them, in the slowly emptying square, a heavy man in his 50s lay, where the thinning crowd had finally let him come to rest, and the people stepping carefully around him still believed, most of them, that he had simply fainted in the heat and the crush, the way people do. It took time for the truth to surface, because the truth did not look anything like an attack. When the crowd had thinned enough for al-Haffar to lie on the ground, rather than be held upright by the bodies around him, his guards finally reached him, and at first they read it exactly as the square read it: a man overcome, a collapse in the crush, the ordinary tragedy of 100,000 people standing for hours in thin mountain air and hard sun. Only later, and only in private, did his own people come to understand that their chief had been killed in the middle of the most heavily guarded gathering in the country, ringed by his own detail, and that not one of them could say how it had been done. The investigation that followed had almost nothing to work with, and the nothing was itself the point. There was no shot for a witness to have heard. There was no attacker for a witness to have seen. There was no device, no vehicle, no cordon breached, no face that any checkpoint had flagged either coming into the city or leaving it. Ghazi Miqdad, who had built an entire career on denying the thin moment, had watched his principal die in the one situation his doctrine had never once covered, and he had watched it from 3 feet away and seen a fly past. A man had been killed by a crowd, and a crowd cannot be arrested, cannot be questioned, cannot be charged. The killing had no surface for an investigator to grip. Al-Haffar's own faction took the loss hardest of all, and took it in private. To lose a chief was one thing. Factions lived with that. To lose him in the middle of 100,000 friendly bodies, guarded by his own trusted men, with no shot, no bomber, and no traitor to name and punish, was something worse. It left them with nothing to avenge and no one to avenge it upon. In the weeks that followed, the men around al-Haffar reportedly turned on one another, hunting for the informer who surely must have existed and did not, because the operation had needed no informer inside the faction at all. It had needed only a barrier plan laid out in the open and a page of published science. For the service that ran Palisade, the achievement was exact and it was measured. A commander who had made himself unreachable for 11 years, who had turned 100,000 strangers into a suit of living armor, had been reached, and reached without a single bystander harmed, without a shot fired into the mass, without the massacre that his whole strategy had assumed no professional would ever be willing to risk. That was the elegance of the thing, and it was real. The same physics that could have killed 100 people had instead killed exactly 1, because the operation had come to understand the physics better than the man who had spent a decade hiding inside it. There was an intelligence dividend too, quieter than the killing, and in some ways larger. An operation like Palisade, once it had worked, changed the private calculations of every man who relied on crowds the way al-Haffar had. The lesson traveled, as such lessons do, through the whispered channels by which frightened men learn what has newly become possible. A tactic that had kept a whole class of targets safe for years, vanish into the mass and no one will dare, had been shown to have a floor beneath it after all. Fear is its own kind of weapon, and by proving that the crowd could be turned, the operation had quietly taken a hiding place away from a great many people who would never once hear its name. But there was a cost, and the operation's own people never pretended otherwise in their own rooms. 100,000 human beings had been turned into the machinery of a killing without their knowledge and without their consent. The density that had pinned al-Haffar had pinned Adi Sharet too, and every child and every old man and every ordinary citizen packed into that ground, and if the surge had run a fraction harder or broken along the wrong line, the very numbers that made Palisade possible would have made a disaster measured in the hundreds. Frisch's page had 2 edges, and they were the same edge. The line that turned a crowd into a weapon was the identical line, at the identical place on the identical chart, past which a crowd begins to crush itself to death from the inside. The operation had walked the whole length of that line, and stepped off it clean. It had also proved, for anyone who cared to look, that the line was there to be walked. There was one last thing the square kept, and it belonged to the men who had stood the closest. In their debriefs, more than one of the 12 came back, unprompted, to the boy. The child pressed against al-Haffar's leg, the rapt sweet passed down without a glance. The small and ordinary kindness of a man who had signed off on terrible things and was, in his final hour, still somehow a man. He had built his safety out of the innocent, and the innocent had, in the end, been the very thing that held him still for the blade. Whether that was justice or only a bleak kind of symmetry was not a question the file ever tried to answer. So, Weigh the two ways of seeing what happened on al-Sabeen Square, because both of them are true and they do not fit together. On one side stands a genuine achievement. A man who had put himself beyond all reach by hiding behind ordinary people was reached at last, and reached so precisely that, of the 100,000 bodies packed around him, exactly one stopped breathing. No massacre, no mistaken target. A killer who had staked his entire survival on the certainty that no one would ever dare act inside a crowd, proven wrong by people who had simply understood the crowd more deeply than he did. On the other side stand 100,000 strangers who came to celebrate their country and went home, never knowing that their packed bodies had been the instrument of a killing, that a line on a physicist's chart had turned their mourning into a weapon, and that only the steadiness of one wave had stood between them and a catastrophe of their own. The operation harmed not one of them. It also used every single one of them. Here is the question we would put to you. If an operation reaches a man who could not otherwise be reached and harms no innocent in the reaching of him, does it matter that it turned 100,000 innocents into the machine that killed him? And would your answer hold if the wave had broken wrong? Tell us in the comments where you are watching from, and tell us where you come down, because this is the kind of case the trade itself argues over in private and almost never settles. If you have stayed with us all the way to here, you already think the way this channel thinks, so subscribe and stand with us for the next file. And if this one gave you something worth arguing about, send it to the people you argue with best, wherever you talk to them. You are the reason we keep opening these files.